Secretary General, focus on reforms, meet NATO standards, fight corruption. Though, so I'm quoting you. That's very extremely important message. While we are in an environment when there is more focus, the easiest to achieve goal. So would you name one or two priorities, especially for NATO, regarding those issues?
The most important thing is to be successful in the fight against corruption, because corruption is hindering and hampering all the other efforts. That's the reason why we have something called Building Integrity, which is a NATO program where we work together with Ukraine on how we can advise and help Ukraine being more successful in the fight against corruption. NATO cannot solve that problem for Ukraine. It has to be Ukraine and Ukrainian leaders that solve the problem, but we can help, we can support, and we can share the experience and advices we have from other countries which have made progress in the fight against corruption.
A few times, many times, you've mentioned the NATO door is open for Ukraine. That's a part of your message. While a lot of the Ukrainian, including Ukrainian politicians, not like that, urge, like, can we speed up? When we would have the, how we can develop with the Ukraine-NATO membership action plan. And there is a legitimate concern that inaction in our part of the world, it provokes those who threaten. We do have this experience. So really, what would be this answer? Understanding that might be the Ukraine would join NATO way later than Ukrainians expect. But what would be this policy? How would you define Ukraine-NATO relations within the nearest future?
The plan is to strengthen our partnership and to work more closely together on many different areas. For instance, on cyber, we are doing a lot and we are stepping up. NATO will provide equipment. We will strengthen the cyber defenses of key Ukrainian institutions, help Ukraine to do so, and also helping Ukraine to develop capabilities to investigate and to attribute who is behind the different cyber attacks. That's one area where we do a lot and where we can step up and do even more, and it's extremely relevant as a response to hybrid threats, hybrid warfare. Then we are also doing a lot when it comes to meeting NATO standards, interoperability, meaning how Ukrainian military forces can strengthen and improve the way they're able to work together with NATO forces. That's good for Ukraine, but it's also good for NATO. On the membership issue, the main message from NATO is that it's a sovereign decision by Ukraine whether it wants to apply or not, and then it's a decision by 28 allies on whether NATO is ready to enlarge and to have a new member. No one else has the right to interfere in that process.
Deterrence and defense, that's what always mentioned. And there was a decision to deploy 4 battalions in Poland and the Baltic states. We extensively covered that as a journalist and pay attention to that. But right after that, there was the announcement by the Russian side, by the President, Minister of Defense, to deploy 30 battalions to the western border of Russia. Then later there was issues about the divisions and even tactical battalions. So what can NATO and what can you do to stop this spiral, at the same time ensuring the safety of those who are there?
For NATO, it is extremely important to respond in a measured and proportionate way. And there can be no doubt that when NATO now is increasing our military presence in the eastern part of our alliance, in the Baltic countries and the Black Sea region, that's a response to the aggressive actions of Russia in Ukraine. No one was discussing this kind of military presence in the east before Russia illegally annexed Crimea and started to destabilize eastern Ukraine. So we are responding, but at the same time we are responding in a proportionate and measured way, because we don't want a new arms race, we don't want a new Cold War. Russia is there to stay, Russia is our neighbor, so therefore we convey the message of defense and dialogue. We need to be firm, we need to be predictable, but at the same time we need to try to avoid tensions escalating and creating an even more difficult relationship with Russia.
Do you think you're successful in that?
I think that without the measured but firm response of NATO, we would have a much more uncertain situation in Europe. By deploying troops to the eastern part of the alliance, we are sending a clear message that an attack on one NATO ally will trigger the response from the whole alliance, because these forces are multinational, and thereby sending a very strong message of deterrence, a multinational response to any attack against any NATO ally. At the same time, we have been able to re-establish dialogue with Russia, and I think that's important, because especially when tensions run high, it is important to talk.
Mr. Ambassador, thanks a lot for the interview, and we would like to really clarify where we are going with the Russian, Ukrainian, German, French talks with Normandy Forum. What would happen next? Because I think there is a level of fatigue from the general public, and there is less understanding than now. But when we know that the German Chancellor Merkel, since the last months, has the chance to talk to most of the participants, to President Poroshenko, to the President Putin. She has met the French president. So really, what's new, and we're also curious, how does Berlin sees the difference in the position of Moscow and Kiev? Where the things are not matching?
Well, what you're asking is the million-dollar question. Yeah, we all have, I think we have a goal in common, but the way to reach this goal is not clear, because it is quite apparent by now, as you say, after 3 years, that there are very divergent opinions on what the actual, how to achieve the goal, and what the content and kind of the detail of the agreements that exist are. So this is in a permanent process, and part of the value of the process is that we at all have a basis, a written basis for the discussions, and that there is discussion. Imagine a situation where we did not have a basis of agreed principles, and where we did not have formats to discuss. It's not worthless to reiterate what the basis is, because we of course know that this basis is under controversial discussion, in particular here. But as for what is required next, our position and the French position is very clear, and it coincides with the Ukrainian position for that matter. It is that, first of all, we need to improve the security situation. We need to have a sustained ceasefire, the moving away of heavy weapons, and thereby a solid basis of no more fighting, on which then one can base further steps in the implementation of the Minsk agreements.
But still, what, for instance, are the demands of the Russian side? If we speak beside the security, which is very clear.
But broadly speaking, we have two packages of the Minsk agreement: the security-related issues and the political issues. And this, the main debate is about which elements of which package come at what time.
As, for instance, I'll add to that, of course, besides the security, there are these issues about, who controls the border, when there are the elections. But these are discussions which are lasting for the last 2 years, all about that. So really, what are discussed now? For instance, if Ms. Merkel meets, both presidents, what issues are raised?
All right. I mean, for instance, if we speak about security, there is the kind of abstract level of maintaining ceasefire. Then we have the disengagement or the moving away of heavy weapons. Then we have the issue of disengagement zones. There's the idea, and it would be really good if there could be disengagement zones, in particular where people cross the line of contact, yeah? And where to have them and how to implement them. One big issue regarding these disengagement zones is the clearing of mines, for instance. Yeah? Then we have another set of issues that have to do with SMM, the access of SMM to all parts which lie within its mandate, the entire territory of Ukraine.
How do you see the impact of this discussion, which is today is more loud than before in the Ukrainian parliament? You see pretty well-known Ukrainian politicians and the public figures who would prefer to dismiss Minsk. How that, and how do you see, how confident you are? And we see that the elections would come. All the parties have to make the, concessions to this idea. Nobody would like to look weak in front of the public.
Yeah, I can only kind of encourage everybody in Ukrainian politics to think in practical and realistic terms. Yeah? Imagine a situation without Minsk. Let's remember, 90% of the civilian casualties in this conflict date from before the Minsk package. Yeah? So you can be annoyed and frustrated about the lack of further implementation of the steps in the Minsk program. But one effect, I would argue, of the Minsk being in existence and there being an international discussion in existence is that it has kind of at least reduced the level of suffering to a certain degree. Yeah? I'm not saying there's no suffering or it's not really bad, but I think it's less terrible as it used to be in 2014. So everybody who wants to kind of scrap Minsk or wants to pass a law in parliament which draws lines in the red lines, yeah, and makes agreement in Minsk on the basis of Minsk impossible or very difficult, have to think what effect that will have. I would argue Minsk is not perfect, but I think it is pretty good if one gets it to be implemented. Yeah.
For these 3 years, you've been talking to hundreds conferences, events to different decision makers, explaining the nature of the fake news. But what we see that today the Western media and some Western experts are coming here to Ukraine and to you in particular to kind of learn your know-how, because there are the fake news in other countries, people looking at the ideas, maybe somebody even despite that's not connected to you are creating their own fact-checking departments. So really, at the stage of today, what are the most interesting things people want to know from your experience, from the experience this region experience with the defamation, with disinformation and information war?
Yeah, you're right. Ukraine became the very first place where disinformation model was used in a way it was used when the Crimean annexation started, or even earlier before, during last days of Euromaidan. And this experience is very interesting because Ukraine was among the very first places where Russia was using information warfare alongside with traditional kinetic warfare, because in other areas we could see the either example of kinetic warfare or information warfare. And Ukraine was the very first place where it happened at the same times and were complementing each other. So that's why the lessons from Ukraine are so interesting and so important. What other countries can learn from Ukrainian experience? And the main question they have: is Russian disinformation model used in Ukraine can be easily transferred to any other country? And our answer is yes, it easily can, because the toolbox used here is pretty much universal.
What's important to understand, there is always the change. There are different trends in what we are speaking. At first we would speak about Crimea, then Donbass, then something else, MH17, then the US elections. But what are the most important stories today? What are the trends? Sometimes you say Ukraine is a failed state, then something else about another country. So locally, if we speak, what are the trends, how the Ukraine is portrayed at this stage? What are the stories? What are the made-up stories? And globally as well?
Yeah, so as I said, propaganda is very adaptive. So they look for the contemporary important issues within each society. And so for Ukraine, they really pick up the issues which would be either important for Ukrainian domestic landscape or for putting Ukraine in very unfavorable position internationally and compromise basically any Ukrainian efforts. So now the main topics would be Ukraine as a failed state. So there's 3 years on, they still continue to prove that Ukraine is not a real state, and they always quote in either weakness or absence of political institutions, or they quote the unsuccessful economic reforms and corruption which dominate in Ukraine to prove that Ukraine basically already collapsed. And also we see the growing amount of war-related fakes again, which was always around. And also they pick up important even cultural issues like upcoming Eurovision contest.
We have just discussed how the content had developed, the trends, but had there been something new within these 3 years from the point of view of the technology, from the way how this, fake news are proliferated? What's new on that front line?
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of changes here and a lot of sophistication in this process, because 3 years ago we started with very simple scenes with photo fakes, video fakes, which were very easy to debunk. And then we moved along to more substantial textual fakes, which sometimes much more difficult to debunk because they combine truth and lies in one piece, and you really need to kind of to split it into different layers to understand, is a story true in general or no? There was a lot of progress in terms of using different technologies.
There is a discussion that that's just one part of the story. That just debunking the fake news isn't really the answer. How you really get out of the thing for the journalism? What you would say on that really you are staying in the same discourse? What is your idea, or what we really do to regain trust if we not just debunk?
Yeah, it was important to start with debunking because you need to start with something. And with debunking and collecting all those stories in one place, you at least can prove that this does exist, this phenomena is around, it's very influential, it's very vast, and it's very systematic. So that's why debunking was very important. The second issue with debunking, you still can reach out to the new audiences all the time that are still hesitating, that's still undecided on important issues. So when you provide them with alternative explanation for what they've just read or seen, that really makes them start thinking critically about media.
Been here for 4 years, a very dramatic time, and I'd like to give the general overview. Was really Ukraine at some point, when we are speaking about it, dealing with IMF on the edge of default, on the edge of bankruptcy? Now it's just kind of a steady cooperation. So can you just very generally say what was the state of affairs, what risks were, and at what conditions are we now?
And it was not a sustainable situation. You had a very large current account deficit, a large fiscal deficit, no growth, reserves which were being exhausted, and an unsustainable exchange rate. So that was the starting point. But of course, with all the shocks that Ukraine has been going through, it has made the situation extremely difficult. I remember vividly from some of the first meetings I had in February 24th of 2014, for example. So these moments were pretty decisive, and I think the international community reacted very, very quickly at the time. With, of course, a lot of commitment from the authorities at the time to show that they were ready to take reforms, and that was something which we forget now, but which was very important for the international community, because the experience previously with Ukraine had been of a lack of commitment to undertake reforms and a number of failed attempts.
So Ukraine over this time had received almost $9 billion of the US dollars. We had the loans, we had the restructurization of the national debt. That looks good so far, but we know that there are that Ukraine has to give the loans back. So, and especially there would be 2018, 2019. So really, would Ukraine be able to really give those money back, or that we would have another talk about restructurization of the debt and also again postponing? So that would be still the loan which you have rather than solution.
I think when we put in place an IMF program and IMF support, which we reassess periodically for each review, every time we look at of course at the capacity of the country to repay. We do not want to overburden the country. That debt restructuring has allowed for to gain some breathing space for some time. But indeed, that means also that the repayments will start to increase after some point. All this, in fact, should be, I think, an additional motivation for the authorities to understand that they need to continue to accumulate reserves. Ukraine at the moment is still not attracting enough foreign direct investment.
So Valeria, if we started to speak about the National Bank, of course, Valeria Gontareva has resigned. There should be still her resignation had to be admitted. But if we're already speaking about a new person, what kind of tasks you are expecting from the new head of the National Bank? What would be that he or she must have to do?
I think it's important to see first that Mrs. Gontareva, as governor of the National Bank of Ukraine during those years, has done a tremendous job in doing what has not been done for way too many years, meaning properly supervising and cleaning up the banking sector. But also reforming the central bank as an institution. It is now a modern central bank with which we can have an informed dialogue. It is really a revamped and new central bank. So there will be an important effort together with the government and the Ministry of Finance to have a proper strategy for state-owned banks. For ensuring a proper governance of state-owned banks. The other one is, of course, the fact that there are a lot of vested interests. There are a lot of bank owners, including in Parliament, which, of course, we're not happy with some of the policies which were, in fact, rightly put in place.
So, can you tell the story of the nationalization of the private bank? As this is a really important issue of the last year, what was the role of the IMF and international community?
First of all, the story is not over because in many ways it is an ongoing process, and we shouldn't forget that. It took several years. First of all, to understand the extent of the problem. Like for many other banks also, which were weak and improperly managed in the system. That was the first step, and which was not an easy step. Now there are a lot of challenges still ahead with the nationalization of that bank. Meaning in particular that there is still a strong need to make the utmost effort to recover as much as feasible from the loans which were not paid. Most of them, as you know, were granted to related parties, basically shareholders and related parties. So that is the main task at the moment. The task of stabilizing the liability side, which is basically the deposit side, has been achieved.
How much is that burden for the Ukrainian economy?
Well, we'll have to assess what will be the final cost. The recoveries in those cases take some time. For the time being, as you know, the cost is in excess of 5% of GDP, but we hope that as much effort will be done to lower that amount.
Ничего не меняется, дорогие товарищи.
Nothing ever changes here. Everything just lingers in one place. Governments come and go. Nothing good ever happens here.
В одном месте топают.
Life on the demarcation line in the frozen conflict zone. It's not the same as life on the border. It's not the same as life at war. On one side here. On one side, there are people who have stayed in the occupied and recognized territory. And on the other, there are displaced people who for decades now have wandered from home to home and dreamt of returning home one day. Even if their home has long been destroyed by war. We spent 4 days on the demarcation line between Abkhazia and the other parts of Georgia. The conflict was frozen almost a quarter of the century ago. In fact, Russia controls all of separatist Abkhazia. So what are the repercussions of this conflict today? We are at the start of the Anguri Bridge, the neutral territory on the demarcation line between Abkhazia and the other part of Georgia. This is the only place where you can cross the border. Every day around 1,000 people cross from one side to the other. They travel to the market at Zugdiri. Children who live in Abkhazia and go to school in Georgia also cross here. The crossing process at the checkpoint can take from 15 minutes to 1 hour. I got through straight away. I rarely go. I've never had any problems. This administrative boundary is for the Georgian contact line. It allows cars with Abkhazian number plates to cross the other side, and they don't require any other additional documentation from the residents of the self-proclaimed republics, which only Russia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Nauru recognize. Abkhazians can freely cross to the Georgian side. Just next to the police station here, there is a representative office of the Georgian Bank on Wheels, a trailer where Abkhazian residents who possess Georgian passports can come and collect their pensions and other social payments. If there isn't a long queue, straight after that you cross the Anguri Bridge. However, for the self-proclaimed government of Abkhazia, there is no line of separation or border. The Abkhazian side and Russian officials do not allow Georgian cars to cross. They require Georgians and foreigners to have visas. In March 2017, they closed 2 out of the 4 checkpoints. The Nabakia and Otobare checkpoints are no longer in operation. In fact, you can cross the administrative boundary and the Nguri Bridge only at the village of Ruhi. You can also enter Abkhazia from the Russian territory at the checkpoint in Psou. For a quarter of a century now, Abkhazians and Russians have been trying to change the once circumstantial demarcation line to a border with all the features of a state line. Abkhazia starts at these fence. We are at the village of Hurcha on the administrative border between Abkhazia and the other part of Georgia. During the war in 1991-1992, this village was controlled by Abkhazia. After that, the two sides agreed that the village would become part of Georgia. Until recently, there was a checkpoint here, thanks to which the residents of the neighboring Abkhazian village could quickly enter Georgian-controlled territory. However, in 2017, Abkhazia and Georgia decided to close the checkpoint. Now this place is deserted and nothing happens here.
Things became difficult. We've always lived together. We went there and back for funerals and weddings. I don't have any of the documents to go there. Those who do have them have to go all the way around to get to the other side. You need to have an Abkhazian passport. Who's going to let me through with a Georgian passport?
What do we know about the participation of the Chechen battalions, of the Chechen fighters who are the soldiers of the Russian army or Russian Guard in Syria, in particular in Aleppo and, but not just there?
We do know that there is so-called military police there. We do know from the region itself that they've been expected to get back, to be sent back home already in January, but that never happened. We do know that another relative nation, they are part of Vainache nation, both Ingush and Chechens. So now Ingush battalion was sent to Syria to support Chechens there. We do not know exactly what are they doing there, but at least the purpose of military police is quite clear. They are supposed to guard military main military stations we do have in Syria. So it's mostly Latakia, I guess.
But we hear about this creation of this center for the training of the special forces in Chechnya, and really there is this notion of the people fighting for Kadyrov. Kadyrovцы, there is this term. But really, who are these people? Whom are they loyal? I mean, they are the part of the Russian Guard. But really, what this force is?
I think this is a special force which is mainly loyal to Kadyrov, but it's clear that on demand they might be requested for any special operations in any parts of Russia. We are in the election year already, and if something is expected in some of our Russian regions, some kind of protests, these people would be definitely the best to attack protesters, and I think those people would be ready to do whatever would be requested by Moscow as well.
How can we describe the relations between Putin and Kadyrov at this stage? Who depends on whom?
Well, if we think that Kremlin depends on Kadyrov in Chechnya, we can say yes, maybe in terms of amount of percent, would it be 99% or would it be 90% or 100% of voters who elected Putin in 2018, if that elections would happen. If we think about money, certainly Kadyrov depends on Putin in terms of money. If we think about security, definitely the moment then Putin would not anymore symbolically support Kadyrov would be a very tough moment for Kadyrov, because his security is very much based on a symbolic support from Moscow.
The investigation of Boris Nemtsov killing, you know, there are other talks about the Chechens participating. We know the investigation is more about the perpetrators, not the those who ordered that. But really, what can we say about this case at this stage?
At this stage, we are quite clear that those who are probably those who executed, those who are assassins, those who've been involved in that, their case is, well, it is not just very easily taken by the prosecutor. The prosecutors are asking tough questions. The prosecutors are providing quite clear evidence that that was a group which was together implementing a special task, but they certainly might do much better than what they're doing. But in the same way, they're doing close to nothing to find out about those who formed this task group, who ordered that assassination, which is clearly showing that there is no demand to investigate who was really involved in the order of assassination, in the same way as investigation of killing of Anna Politkovskaya, for example, was organized.
Symbolically, what does this agreement mean, and in practice, what does this agreement actually do?
What it does, first of all, what it means. What it means is Canada is open for Ukraine. That's the symbolic meaning. We have opened up with this agreement 98% of our market duty-free and quota-free for Ukraine. That's the biggest opening of any of Ukraine's trade agreements, apart from the now not quite operational CIS agreement. So a lot of the things that Ukrainians have difficulty getting into other markets, they'll be able to get into Canada's market problem-free. Up until now, you've had to pay, or the importers had to pay 14, I think, or 15% duty. Now it's 0.
Okay.
So suddenly you've become that much more competitive in our market. Similarly, if you're a canner of peaches or apricots and you want to ship them to Canada, before you may have had a duty of, I think there's something around 7 or 8%, now it's 0. So suddenly you've just got a price advantage over other countries that don't have a free trade agreement with Canada.
Does it legitimize Ukraine as a trading partner for other G7 countries as well?
I think we hope it'll have a kind of positive halo effect. And the one thing that we've noticed about our free trade agreements is, A, they tend to at least double trade within the first couple of years, but they also tend to double investment, even though they're not investment agreements per se. But what it does is it attracts people's attention to this trading relationship, and they begin to look at offers, ideas for working with that country that they may never have thought of before.
Right.
And we're certainly seeing also a positive dynamic on the investment side.
And what are the concerns of probably Canadian businessmen? They probably ask you sometimes when they hear, you know, like there are the Ukrainians in Canada, of course, but we're not speaking about them. They're speaking, oh, this country, they have all these troubles with their war, corruption, all the things. What are the questions they ask?
You know, people are concerned. I think what I do is I tell them it's a big country by European standards. You know, I think Canadians are used to thinking of European countries as being small. Ukraine is about 25 Belgiums. So trouble at one end doesn't mean it's hot and impossible at the other end of the country. We're seeing, for example, a major boost in exports of concentrated apple juice coming from Western Ukraine to Canada. So Ukraine's a big country, you can source things. And also, it's not like Canadian business has never dealt with countries dealing with localized conflict before. We work very closely with a partner like Mexico in NAFTA. Mexico has had pretty traumatic experiences with what people there call a drug war. Of course, it's been a high degree of civil unrest, but affecting certain parts of the country, but then others have done business very effectively with Canada. Same with Colombia. Again, all comparisons are false, but there are ways of working with Ukraine, and especially I think clients in the IT sector have been very, very pleased and are also increasing their engagement with Ukraine right now.
2015 was obviously a big year for Canada to contribute to Ukraine. The numbers were staggering. It was almost about 10% of the international assistance budget of Canada went to Ukraine, which was about $500 million.
That included two big loans.
Right. Yeah. Are those numbers that are going, like the 2016 stats haven't come out yet, but
we're not going to repeat 2015.
Right.
That was an exceptional year. We have just extended our military mission, Operation Unifier. Keeping 200 soldiers abroad is not a cheap thing, and also we pay for a lot of the expenses of our Ukrainian partners as well. In doing this, we find it's been very effective, and we're looking over the next 2 years, because it's been extended to 2019, to kind of go up the value chain and look to see if we can have more impact by training non-commissioned personnel, officers and others as we go forward with that mission. Certainly also carrying on with our development assistance, we will stay engaged on the humanitarian side as well with the police and other security agencies. That's very promising. We've got right now I think 13, but could be up to 20 serving police officers also working as mentors with Ukrainian police.
What would you tell Canadians that they can expect as a return on that money?
They can expect a more successful, stable, and prosperous Ukraine that will be a better economic and security partner for us.
Do you personally believe in the so-called theory that the more women are in the power, the less violence and warfare and poverty are in the world?
I do believe that that in fact that women have more of a capability of reaching out to each other and having a way of empathy and understanding each other. I don't think that not every woman I've ever met or studied has been has not used force. And so I think we have to be careful about generalizations, but I do think that women have a capability of reaching out, understanding, working with each other across ethnic lines or tribal lines, and I've seen it in a number of countries, and certainly something that when I was Secretary of State I promoted, and then Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, really worked on that whole process. And it all began in many ways at the Beijing conference 25 years ago, when Hillary Clinton said women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights, and every country undertook a plan of action. And so the question is how we keep pursuing that and make it a common effort.
You're the co-founder of the Monkey Cage, which is a very interesting, publication on the Washington Post on where it combines the researchers and the journalists on research on data and its influence to the politics. To what extent the big data, the data today, influence the politics?
To the extent that governments are making more and more data publicly available and transparent and available to be scraped off the internet by researchers. This is a tremendous opportunity for journalists, that this is a whole new subject of ways in which journalists, I think, can learn about things that the state is doing in ways that were never possible before. So one of the big questions people have been interested in the last few months in particular is the role of this kind of, how is social media impacting elections and how are big data impacting elections? And I think we want to think about this in a kind of few different ways. One of the big ideas of social media is that social media allows candidates to communicate directly with the public without being intermediated by journalists, without having to go through the mass media, without having to get someone to cover you, that you can tweet or post on your Facebook page. This new media technology of being able to tweet or put things on Facebook or Vkontakte, where that bleeds over into the established media and its coverage. And I think this is where President Trump is a kind of mastermind of this new world, where he's able to direct the conversation on TV, on our news networks like CNN and Fox News, by tweeting. This is not something that's going to be enjoyed by most politicians, right? This is something that is probably limited to presidential candidates, and it may even be limited to particular types of presidential candidates. Part of why Trump's tweets attract so much attention is that they're sort of outside the bounds of normalcy. This is not what you expect from a politician. And I think it's going to be very interesting to watch in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, as other politicians try to help structure the media conversation by using social media in this way, whether other politicians will be as successful as he is if they are not willing to sort of embrace the way that he has chosen to sort of use this media in a kind of almost shocking way to say things that people wouldn't have expected from a presidential candidate. The incredible power of Facebook is that if you know from your own campaign research that white 40 to 50-year-old voters in Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio are particularly concerned about trade deals, you can go to Facebook and say, I want to run ads that reach white 40 to 50-year-old voters in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio, and I want them to talk. This is the ad. This is the very specific ad I want to run that will appear on the Facebook feeds. And when you combine that with the sort of huge big data sources that are out there that allow campaigns and marketers to learn about preferences of citizens, I think it allows for this kind of sneaky feeling that you're being targeted with exactly what's important to you.
It's about the polarization of the society and this idea of us living in the bubbles.
Right.
And it's a very popular talk today that we are living in the bubbles, where there is a question, maybe we used to live in the bubbles, we just didn't know about that.
So on the one hand, there is a lot of evidence that social media allows you to find like-minded people. So if you're the most, extreme person in your village, right, and previously you had, views that were far off the mainstream, previously you might think, well, nobody shares my views. Social media allows you to find lots of other people who can share your views. And this is for good and for bad, right? Like you can think you might be, and this is the same sort of thing that has allowed, well, we don't have to put any normative in. If you have a view that's not shared by a lot of people in your community, previously you would not be able to find people who shared that view. Now social media allows you to find people. And you can build your own communities online where you share that information, and ultimately you can coordinate with people in those communities to be political actors in a way that you probably couldn't have. Now, we might think that in authoritarian regimes, maybe some of the people who have those minority views are people who were pro-democracy, who were previously excluded from the political conversation because the state didn't want those voices heard. And so that might be when people talked about social media as liberation technology, it allowed pro-democracy activists to find each other and coordinate. In other situations where where generally the people who are excluded from having voice like this are more extreme voices, on the other hand, when you look at communities like Facebook, like Twitter, there are so many people who are on Facebook in the United States at least, right? People join Facebook, they make their friends on Facebook, not just based on political reasons. They make it based on who their kids go to school with and their cousins and their family and their friends from when they were growing up. So actually what turns out is there's a lot of opportunities for information to permeate across different political ideologies. Now, that in turn can actually, if you were concerned about this sort of topic of fake news or misinformation, that can actually make things more likely to spread across grower things because it's not so, these internet bubbles are not so hermetically sealed from each other.
Communist Shadow, that's your book is named, and it's researching the legacy of communism on the democratic countries and how it influenced, the democracy, gender, and the economy. So really, being now in Ukraine, we're absolutely curious. What are your findings?
What we did in the book was we looked at attitudes, sort of fundamental questions, like what citizens think about democracy, what they think about markets, what they think about social welfare, whether the state should provide social welfare, and what they think about gender equality. And what we discovered was that when you look at attitudes in post-communist countries, so former Soviet Union and East Central Europe, and you compare those attitudes towards those found in the rest of the world of citizens who are living outside of the post-communist world, we found that there was systematically less support for democracy, less support for markets, more support for state-provided social welfare, but interestingly, not more support for gender equality among post-communist citizens. So we had looked in these particular areas because we were interested in the legacies of communism. And these areas, thinking about multi-party government, states versus markets, state-provided social welfare, and social equality. These were sort of fundamental tenets of communism. So we found in 3 of these 4 cases the sort of differentials we expected. And so then the question was, what could explain for these differences? And in the book, we look at 2 sort of general classification of explanations.
There is globally this perception that, the communism were emancipated,
right.
And they were emancipating. And honestly, we should also confirm that some of the things we, the Ukrainians, when we see in some other societies, with, for instance, access to the labor and the fact, that the women in Ukraine were always working compared to some of the, the countries like Austria, where
right.
they were still didn't receive the pensions till end of 60s. That was pretty surprising, but still, what have you found?
Yeah, so that was what we thought. Social equality was an important part of communist doctrine. There were obviously real attempts in communist societies to try to provide for gender equality. But what we found when we looked at the data is that this surplus of support for gender equality, the way we found it in a surplus of support for state-provided social welfare, does not exist. If anything, there's actually, in the post-communist era, less support for gender equality than there is in other countries, although it's not very strong evidence in that regard. We think that there's a sort of stronger gap between rhetoric and reality in terms of gender equality than there is in these other issues. So if you think about markets, it really was, communism was state-run economies despite some variation, in individual countries. In terms of democracy, you can say what you will about rhetoric, but these really were single-party states almost exclusively. And the state did provide rather generous social welfare benefits in most cases under communism. But when you turn to gender equality, right, there was a lot of talk about gender equality, but you rarely, if ever, saw women in the Politburo. You rarely, if ever, saw women in leadership positions in industry. There was a lot of emphasis on women entering the labor market, but then there's a lot of, if you talk to people who work on this, the question was that if you may have had women in the labor market, but was labor at home, was the work in the home shared across men and women? Most of the time the answer will be no. Women were in the labor market, but they were also carrying out a great deal of responsibility at home. So we think that's one explanation, that it might be this gap between rhetoric and reality.